The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded, though they were previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Clifford Mason, the author of a very, very interesting book, The African American Bookshelf. Welcome to African American Legends, Cliff.
Thank you, Roscoe. Thanks for having me.
I have read this beautiful book. Here it is right here, The African American Bookshelf. It's called 50 Must-Reads Before the Civil War, from before the Civil War through today. And what that really is a panoramic trip through African American history, through key documents that you've identified.
Tried to cover everything.
So the thing I want to ask you first is, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, actually, the reason for that is very prosaic. My agent called me.
It's very economic.
Very right. And what had happened was I had a contract to do a book earlier on the civil rights movement of the 60s. And I got into the research and it kept taking me further back and back and back. So finally, I ended up with something I called Burning the Confederate Flag, which was a history in depth of the racism and that sort of stuff. But it was strictly historical narrative. It wasn't dealing with books. Needless to say, my agent could not get that sold. Nobody wanted to buy a book talking about burning the Confederate flag. So the project died. 4 years later, he calls me and says somebody's interested in doing a book about books. And so a lot of the research I had from the original project, I was able to use. Half the books most of these books actually are in my library at home, so there was not much of a stretch for me.
Most of those books are classic books,
yeah,
which
well,
almost everyone who's interested in African American history and literature should have in their collection, although in these modern days, it's on the computer and you pull it down or you go to the library.
It's not as much fun as actually having the book, though.
That's right. I certainly agree.
I mean, you can read a book anywhere, and it's more relaxed. You feel as if you're with a friend, you're conversing. I think it was Emily Dickinson who said, no ship is like a book.
Well,
Carries
it
you
is.
everywhere.
Of course, remember, time changes and the method of communication changes. At one time, it was all oral.
Yeah.
Then it was written on the papyrus, and then you had the Gutenberg press, and now we have this plethora of books coming out. But the counter to that are the videotapes, the audio books, and so on. Although I must agree, it's nothing like having the actual document in your hand.
They publish about 80,000 books a year in this country. So there's an awful lot of books out
Awful
there.
lot, and about 1% of them are probably worth reading. All right, let's talk about how you went about making the selections.
Well, that was tough, because originally I was going to do 100 books. But that would have meant each book would have had like about a half-page commentary. And I was interested in just doing an anthology with half-page notes. I wanted to actually get into the meat of the thing. And so in order for me to be able to write an essay of some depth, we had to cut the list in half because the publisher did not want to publish a book of 600 pages.
Now that's very interesting, because just looking at the title, you would think that this book would be excerpts from these 50 must-reads. But actually, it is an essay on each book, giving the historical context and indicating what the author may have said and what the meaning was in the context of African American history, which I found very interesting.
Yeah,
you also had, I'm sure, a publisher's problem in terms of copyright. How much can you actually copy?
Fair use limits you to about 350 words, except for poetry. With poetry, you can't reproduce anything without spending a lot of money. So that's why there's no poetry in the book, because it just became economically not possible. But yeah, if you read the book and you read the essays surrounding each particular selection, you get a little mini course in that book, and you also get a sense of where that book belongs in the total history of American history. And also I have introductions to each section. I divide the book into 6 different sections, so I bring you along chronologically, and that way you have a sense of the whole history. And the things I emphasize are not the things that are traditional American history, but I emphasized things that were seminal to black American history. For
clearly.
example, slavery was not a national issue until the 1850s. Prior to that, anybody could run for president and not have to talk about slavery because nobody cared. It wasn't until the 1850s that slavery had to be discussed, which is how Lincoln got elected, because he out-talked everybody else on the issue of slavery. So you get the general thing as well as the specific thing. Now, in terms of the books that I chose and why I chose them, it was really two things. One, I wanted fighters. You know, there are a lot of important people who are great role models, and no criticism of them, but they just aren't fighters in terms of pushing things forward, in terms of the cutting edge. Marian Anderson, Ella Fitzgerald, those people are great people, Mary McLeod Bethune, and they're important. But I wanted the Nat Turners and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Ida B. Wellses, you know, and the Sojourner Truths and Harriet
You use the
Tubmans.
word fighters, you really
Yeah.
mean advocates.
Well, if you want to be semantical, but the idea is that issues that were life and death issues at the time, these people stepped up to the plate. Ida B. Wells confronted Woodrow Wilson on lynching, and she herself could not return to Tennessee because she'd written so strongly against lynching that they weren't going to lynch her. So people who were taking those types of stands.
In other words, people such as the people today who opposed the war in Iraq,
There you go.
who really
Right,
lost some
right.
of their status.
That's
the
right.
Dixie Chicks,
Right.
Danny Glover,
There
and
you
so
go, Danny
on.
Glover. They took away his MSN commercial, MCI commercial
yeah.
because of it. Yeah.
But now, in organizing the book, you used around themes. You talked about the first freedom, that all shall be free, and that talked about, you know, when we first got here, the struggle to maintain our dignity, Nat Turner, and so on. You call it accommodation, the Civil War, how the Reconstruction worked out. And you have a nice section in there on literature, because literature is really a very powerful political tool.
No question about it.
Sometimes it's not noted as a political tool, but it clearly is, and you reflected on that. And then finally you get into the World War II era and the post-World War II. And finally, your statement about the president is the emperor's new clothes, which I find to be a very interesting categorization. And you talked about people like Barack and others who just kept pulling the charade that exists in this country about racism, which still exists today.
Yeah.
So the book is really quite a contribution,
Well, thank you,
quite a
Oscar.
very good contribution.
In terms of literature, yes, and actually it's known the power of protest through literature.
Oh, clearly.
Because that's why the publishing business is so conservative. I mean, Richard Wright has a poem called Between the World and Me, which is a poem
Yeah.
about lynching.
Beautiful poem.
And when I was teaching in Medgar Evers, we had it in the anthology that was used as a textbook. And when the second edition came out, they had taken the poem out of that second edition. He has a collection of short stories called Uncle Tom's Children, and talks about the violence growing up as a teenager in the Deep South in the 20s and 30s. I mean, the violence was just errant. It didn't have to be any reason for it. You know, you just turn a corner and walk down a road, and all of a sudden you were dead because you just happened to be there. And I remember giving a course to a group of teachers about that. And so they said, well, is that real? That really happened? I mean, people just don't want to face it. And then the lynchings. The book on lynching that I have, called 100 Years of Lynching, from 1859 to 1969, at least 5,000 African Americans were lynched. There was no war going on. The black people who were lynched were just trying to stay alive and go about their business.
Now, for those who are young and may not really know what lynching is, because there's practically no physical lynching, there's a lot of political lynching. What is lynching, and how did it get to be called lynching, and so on?
Well, I don't know the genesis of the actual word. I assume that's...
It was a man named Lynch who actually went out and
did
got
it.
some blacks and strung them up, and that's why it's called lynching. Yeah.
I thought maybe it's because the first one happened in Lynchburg, Virginia, but but it was very grotesque, because what would happen is they wouldn't necessarily, as they do in the movies, hang a guy high up and have him dangle in the wind. Sometimes his feet were touching the ground. They were just tied to a tree.
They would beat him.
And they'd burn him, and they'd say things like, don't kill the nigger too quick. And they'd cut off fingers and ears and toes and pass them around as mementos. And if people couldn't get a piece of the human flesh, then they'd buy a piece of the tree and stuff like that. And 400 women were lynched. Very few people realize that. In Valdosta, Georgia, a woman was pregnant, and they lynched her. Cut open her stomach. The fetus fell onto the ground. They stomped it to death. So, I mean, that's genocide. You know, you can't call that anything else. So these are the types of things that I not only highlight, but that I use as a basis for explaining why we need a canon of African American literature and history, biography, and the arts, because of all the accomplishments. You have the accomplishments on one hand, and you have the racism on the other hand. And the one explains the reason why the other doesn't exist. And yet that accomplishment, that record, which helped to make the American miracle possible, is a record that, unless it is included, made part of the general canon on every level, racism will continue to flourish, because you cannot patronize or discriminate against somebody if you have proof that the person is as good as you are. Not theoretically good, but in practical reality, actual accomplishment good. I mean, the Industrial Revolution, patents and innovations, I mean, we own that stuff. Sarah Boone, the ironing board. Garrett Morgan, the gas mask and the street light. Jan Metzilaher, the shoe last, which made America the shoe capital of the world. They spent millions of dollars, well, tens of thousands, trying to get anybody to come up with a machine that would keep the upper and the lower part of a shoe together. It doesn't sound like much today, but the fact of the matter is that they couldn't find a machine that did it in those days, and every time they did come up with a machine, the damn shoe would separate after a week. So they had to go back to hand stitching, because no machine could duplicate the intricate movements of the human hand. This guy, living in Lynn, Massachusetts, tubercular, penniless, with baling wire and plywood, comes up with the damn thing. When he sends the machine to Washington, they say it's too complicated. It'd never work. He goes down to Washington, proves to them that it works. They give him the patent. The shoe company buys the patent from him and gives him cash, gives him bonds that cannot be turned into cash during his lifetime, so he dies penniless, and they go on to make the millions. So it's just one example. You know, Charles Drew, the blood bank,
one of the things,
Granville T. Wood's third rail, my goodness.
one of the things about looking at African American history and looking at it through literature, through books, you realize that this happened. You realize that what happened helped to make this country the way it is.
Right.
And the problem is the general denial of the larger population and the lack of awareness of many of the black population about our contributions to the world, to society, to this country. Literature helps. I think if anyone read this book, by the end of the time they finished reading it, they'd be angry and at the same time motivated to do something.
That's the right reaction, Roscoe.
But the problem, of course, is that there are many counter forces, the major one being the major media, or the other one being the way in which the political system operates, including the stealing of the election in Florida.
Right.
So one of the things that has to be balanced, you have to balance the anger and your awareness with where do we go from here? What are some of the things that can be done? Now, you did not willingly include Booker T. Washington.
I included him because historically I needed him.
But now that's what I wanted to ask you, because Booker T. Washington was known as an accommodationist. Of course, you have to realize when he was functioning at the end of the time of the black codes and the lynching in 1895, when he gave his Atlanta Compromise speech, if he had taken the Du Bois, get everybody educated thing, he'd have been dead and everybody else would.
He might have been dead, but he wouldn't have been known.
Yeah. So the question I'm going to ask you, because I know you're not an aficionado of Booker T. Washington, because you thought he was an accommodation.
I can answer.
Now, why did you include him?
Well, historically, you have to include him, because otherwise there'd be a gap. He was the most powerful black man in America at the time. And he was more
Why
powerful.
was he the most powerful black man?
Because of the accommodation. They wanted to hear that. And see, Malcolm X says it. Malcolm X says, the man doesn't care whether you're right or wrong. He just cares if you're for him or against him. If you're for him, you're right. If you're against him, you're wrong. So if anybody had gotten up and said to any other ethnic group, the Armenians, the Catholics, the Irish, the Jews, that we can be the same economically as a fist, but we have to be separate as the fingers on the hand, they'd run him out of town.
Well, the fact
But
is,
he says it, and everybody says, that's the way to be separate but equal. Hallelujah.
But the fact is, for the Catholics who came, for the Italians, for the Jews, and so on, they were separate. This was a very, very separate, segmented
Yeah,
country.
at the time.
Now, what?
But nobody got up and said you were segmented.
Well, many of them did.
I mean,
many of them
individual,
did.
but
what
not as an official
what Booker
policy.
T. Washington was saying. Remember, we had some 12 million. Not many. It's probably about 8 million blacks who had been recently freed from slavery, and they were trying to integrate them into the society. His idea is you're not going to be able to do it by managing the money, but you need agriculture, you need mechanics, and so on. And his idea, well, let's get the support from the corporate establishment to help educate in these technical areas, these blacks, so we then have the economic power. See, a lot of things people overlook is that Booker T. Washington founded the National Negro Business League. He was one of the first people who said, let's use our economic power to make a change. And it's interesting to today, many African Americans are saying the same thing.
Yeah,
let's
but Roscoe,
use our economic power.
The reason why we're in the situation we're in now is because of those types of compromises to get ahead.
How can you justify that?
Well, because as long as you say to the guy, okay, you're in charge, give me a crumb and I'll be better off than I was before. As long as you keep doing that, you're never going to get ahead. As a matter of fact, Booker T. Washington actually said that black people made a mess of Reconstruction and they have to pay for it. I mean, the guy was an apologist. And when the chips were down and he needed Taft and Teddy Roosevelt to stop the massacre in killing the black men in Houston and the Teddy Roosevelt's wholesale dismissal of the blacks in Brownsville without a trial, 137?
Yeah.
67 actually. He begged them not to do it. They didn't listen to him. When chips were down, they didn't listen to anything he had to say. So in the final analysis, as far as I'm concerned, Booker T. Washington is there as a negative.
But history is always 20/20 looking backwards.
That can go for both of us.
Recall, we've had a number of great leaders. Many of them have espoused positions that you and I would agree with, and some not.
Yeah.
I happen to be one who identifies more with W.E.B. Du Bois, but the fact
I
is,
understand where you're coming
at
from.
that particular point
I understand
in time,
what you're saying.
there is and so that is the interesting part of looking at your book, because you find that we may call it accommodationist. Some of the accommodations made it possible. Let's, for example, the Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah.
Tuskegee Airmen, which I was in, the 100th Fighter Squadron, flew missions, and so on. At the time they were created because of the pressure of the black population, NAACP, to have blacks in combat positions.
Right.
The NAACP initially wanted this to be integrated.
Right.
They wanted us to be trained all over the South.
Sure.
If that had happened, there would have been no black pilots. It wouldn't.
Oh.
So Fred Patterson at Tuskegee made the accommodation, said, look, Tuskegee is a place where there are a number of educated blacks. We have good relations. We got good accommodations. We will take the initiative and bring them there.
I understand that you have to accommodate, Roscoe.
So I'm not arguing.
In other words, I had to accommodate to get this book published.
Yeah,
I couldn't keep in Mumia. Yeah. I couldn't keep in Brown, Warren.
Well,
the editor didn't want it. He wanted to take out the lynching. I had to accommodate to get the book published. So of course you have to accommodate to survive. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad that I included Booker T. Washington so we could have this discussion right now.
That's what it stimulates.
And also realize that at the time Booker T. was so powerful that he controlled the black press almost completely. If a newspaper published something he didn't like, he'd just withdraw his advertising, or he'd buy the newspaper out.
On the other hand, you did cover Ida B. Wells, who was a fighter who did not deal with Booker T. Washington's position.
As a matter of fact, she should have been a founding member of the NAACP, but she was excluded because somebody thought that she was too strong.
Too radical. So the conversation we just had is the kind of conversation that should be stimulated in classrooms and colleges, etc.
Garvey, for example. I was ignorant about Garvey. Growing up as a kid, I thought, Garvey had gone way out and done something really awful, and that's why they got him 5 years in federal prison. He must have done something really bad. Garvey did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. It's mind-boggling. When they went into court, they said, cage the tiger. He was supposed to be a tiger. Why? Because he wanted black people to parade down Fifth Avenue? Because he wanted to start a business? Because he sent equipment to Africa to build it rather than destroy it? That makes him a tiger? They had an envelope with a return address that they couldn't even read. And the guy indicated that he sent a check for $1.25 and he can get his money back. So Garvey was given 5 years in prison for defrauding, using the mails of fraud. I mean, nothing could be more absurd. I mean, as soon as he started to do what he did to get black pride, Herbert Hoover began to get a file on him, even before the FBI was the FBI.
But let's go back. You talk about black pride. Black people have always had pride.
Yes.
And the pride is expressed in a number of things, clearly through the church, through the music, through the literature, through the poems, etc.
Right.
The problem that I see is that when the pride begins to move over into the political arena,
Yeah.
there tends to be a difference of opinion
Yeah.
as to whether this pride is too strong or not too strong.
Well, it's not allowed to exist at all as soon as it becomes political. If you keep it in church, you got no problem.
Well, that's not true, because the music now, which some people don't like, and has always expressed a form of black pride.
Yeah, but I mean, they don't mind that. I mean, Bob Marley was saying burning and looting tonight, and people sang the songs, but it didn't matter.
Well,
it doesn't translate.
It did matter, because the government in Jamaica wasn't very happy about
Yeah,
Marley
but it
saying
didn't
that.
translate. I mean, Seaga got into power when Reagan gave him money. I mean, so if you're singing and dancing, it's okay. No matter how strong the lyrics are, you're singing and you're dancing.
Well, what does offend the establishment?
Anybody who gets up and becomes a political animal, Al Sharpton, people like that. Those are the things that people don't want. They want to destroy it. And as a matter of fact, if you look, I mean, today people walk around thinking that the Black Panthers were illegal, thinking that Malcolm X was an anarchist. The Black Panthers, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Malcolm X, none of them suggested anything that was illegal. Everything that they suggested was within the bounds of law. The only man in this entire book who tried to destroy the system was Nat Turner.
Yeah.
Everybody else tried to work within the system.
That's true. But remember, in the First Amendment, when you say kill every white man, the First Amendment allows us to do that. It's one of the great things about the Constitution.
Yeah, if you're conservative.
And so,
if you're conservative, you have freedom of speech. If you're not conservative, you haven't got it. They destroy you. They shut you up.
That is true. What I'm saying is that when you look at the spectrum, you say 50 must-reads, you're talking about from 16...
from actually the middle of the 16th century, 1530s, an explorer.
Through
Randall Robinson,
through
1998.
today.
Yeah, right.
It gives you plenty to think about. And the thing that I'm interested in is how this can be integrated into curriculum and teaching.
Yeah, that's important.
Because you and I are having a great discussion.
Yeah.
Because we have an insight
and we have a background.
And a background.
And we've lived this stuff.
And we've lived it. But then how do you deal with, let's see, 14, 15, 18-year-old young people have no background whatsoever?
Well, I was talking in Boys and Girls High School in Brooklyn, and I was telling them about Harriet Tubman and all of the great things she did. In fact, that she was only 5'1", and she carried a gun, and if anybody didn't listen to what she did, she blew them away. So this young woman is sitting there, she said, oh, she must have been high on crack.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was an amazing leap.
Well,
but at least she was listening, right?
So
I had to explain to her that there was no crack in those days. Yeah. But the idea that a black person could be that independent was something she couldn't deal with.
She didn't shoot everybody. I don't know how many people she shot.
She didn't have to. All she did was brandish the gun.
But and that's a very good point, because what we understand, either from our own backgrounds or from our readings in history, many of the younger generation don't understand, or the way in which control is exercised through wiretaps and surveillance and plants and so on certainly raises the anxiety level and the credibility level of these young people.
Yeah, and so the teachers are afraid.
Well, I'm not talking about the teacher.
I know, but I'm just saying in terms of what they're going to learn. Because you say, how do we apply it? So some of my choices, like George Jackson, they will relate to a George Jackson. They relate to Harriet Tubman. They relate to Malcolm X. So once you get them in there, the guy who stole the Confederate boat, Robert Smalls, and sailed it into the Union Navy and got his freedom that way and became a 6-term congressman from South Carolina. I mean, these are things that they're going to relate to.
Will they? That's very interesting.
Oh, yeah. If you tell the story in a dramatic way, they'll become involved. And once you get them hooked, then they start reading.
Yeah, but history is not drama directly.
But you have to begin with the drama.
History is
you asked me how to do it. That's how you do it.
Okay. Well,
you make it a sitcom.
what about analysis? What about
Well,
analysis?
that's where you have to deal with the teachers. The teachers have to learn how to analyze these things in such a way as to explain it. Because what happens is people are taught not to be judgmental. That's the problem. They're taught to take facts as they are and just repeat the facts.
Take what people say are facts.
Yeah. You know,
right.
the official version.
Yeah.
You know, which is the Emperor's New Clothes idea. You know, there's no racism in America. Blah blah blah. Right. So if you teach people how to analyze, how to be critical, then they can apply that when they're making their presentation to the students. So that's where the teachers have to be
in a
trained.
sense, the reading itself, your analysis of these various 50 must-reads is very insightful. In other words, you take both the devil's advocate position and the advocate position. And if
You
someone,
have to make it interesting. You
if
can't
some-
just have
Well,
an knee-jerk
not only
response to
interesting,
just one thing. You have
not
to,
only interesting, intellectually honest.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that we have to do is to analyze what the situation is, what the factors were, and how do we dealt with them.
Right.
And you did a good job of this.
Thank you.
Which means that using this in a school, in a class, in a discussion group, this would be a great book for people, African Americans,
Anybody who's well-read who wants to know about the history. Right.
know about history.
Because I criticized Du Bois.
How did we get to be where we are?
Yeah.
And that's what this tells us.
Yes.
Now, the next thing I'm going to ask you, which you don't have the answer to, I'm sure,
I'll try.
is where should we go?
What's the solution?
What's the
Boing.
solution? And of course, that is the ongoing discussion,
Yeah,
the
right.
ongoing dilemma, the whole idea of African American history when we push for more inclusion was to look at where we've come from, what our situation is,
And
and
now
where
where
we
we're
should go.
going, yeah.
And that is why it is so
Yeah.
stimulating to read a book like this and to have some interaction about the book.
Well, thank you, Roscoe. My answer to that very quickly is Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. In other
Okay,
words,
thank you very much,
That's it?
Clifford Mason, the African American Bookshelf. We had a really interesting discussion, and I hope everyone gets a chance to read it.
thank
Take
you,
care.
Roscoe. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.